I'm going to go ahead and click record. Welcome. It's great to have you all here today for our workshop on information creation as a process. If you haven't been to one of the workshops in this series before, I did want to let you know that all participants are automatically muted. But if you do have questions or comments, you can feel free to share those in the chat box. And Stephanie and I will be monitoring that. Stephanie will also be sharing all the links that you see throughout the workshop today in the chat box to make it easier for you to grab those links. So we'll go ahead and jump in. So the focus for our workshop today is on information creation as a process, and we're going to look at this concept as it is presented in the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. We're going to look at some potential student learning bottlenecks that might be related to this concept and think about some strategies, activities, or assignments that you could use to teach this concept. For anyone who hasn't been to one of our workshops before, my name is Jane Hammonds. I am an assistant professor in the university libraries. I'm the teaching and learning engagement librarian. And my email is hammonds.73@osu.edu. And if you do have any comments, questions, would like any feedback, I am always happy to talk more about information literacy. So please don't hesitate to send me an email after the workshop. For those of you that are here for the first time, this is the 5th workshop in a series on information literacy concepts, the 6 information literacy concepts from the Framework for Information Literacy. You don't need to have attended the previous ones, so if you've missed that, that's fine. But if you are interested in seeing any of those, all those materials are available for anyone to view, and Stephanie will be sharing the links to all of the previous workshops in the chat box, and we'll also have them in this presentation. I will be sending everyone a copy of the presentation afterwards, so you'll have that as well. So I hope that those of you that have attended one of the workshops will forgive me for just 1 minute if I briefly outline the Framework for Information Literacy for anyone who may be attending their first workshop. The Framework for Information Literacy was published by the Association of College and Research Libraries in 2015 as a way to provide an updated and expanded definition of information literacy. So the perspective on information literacy that is presented in the framework is a very conceptual view of information literacy. Previous understandings of information literacy had focused very heavily on skills, what students were able to do. The framework really focuses more on what students need to understand in order to be able to effectively engage with information. And so the framework highlights 6 core concepts that are important for students to really grasp if they're going to be able to effectively engage with information. These are core concepts that expert researchers, scholars, instructors understand. Sometimes we don't even know that we understand them. We may not be able to expressly articulate what the concept is, but it's something still that we understand about how research works, about how scholarship works, about how sources are used in academic research that students may not fully grasp yet. But without those understandings of those concepts, a lot of the things that we ask them to do related to research may not really make that much sense. So it kind of creates this gap in understanding. There are things that we as expert researchers understand, sometimes tacitly, that students may not, and it creates those frustrations and those misunderstandings when we have research or inquiry-based assignments. So information creation is one of those 6 core concepts that are outlined. The other concepts that we've covered are scholarship as conversation, research as inquiry, authority is constructed and contextual, and information has value. And then the last concept is searching as strategic exploration, and we'll be covering that in the next workshop next week. So to jump more specifically into information creation as a process, we'll have a video. Before we get to that though, I did want to again encourage everyone, if you haven't had a chance to download the information creation as a process action plan. This is a document that sort of gives you a guide for thinking about how you might integrate information creation as a process into a course or an assignment. And so if you download that document, you'll be able to refer to it throughout the workshop. This is optional, you don't have to do it, but we do want to make this as workshop-y as possible. So when I do a face-to-face workshop, I always try to make sure that all participants leave with something in hand, leave with a plan in hand for what they're going to do. So we wanted to give everyone the option to do that as well for this workshop. So you can refer to this document throughout, share your thoughts on that document, and then you'll leave with at least some initial thoughts on how you can integrate this concept into your course. So yeah, Stephanie has shared that information again. The action plan document is in the links in the chat there if anyone wants to download that. Okay. So information creation as a process. What are we talking about here? We'll start with a brief video. It's about 1 minute and 25 seconds, I believe, that provides a broad overview of what we're talking about. Hopefully everyone will be able to hear this.
For her master's thesis, Lily is exploring the representations of women in comic books and how this has changed over time. When discussing her project with her advisor, she proposes a new idea. Instead of writing a paper on the topic, she wants to create her own comic book that will provide a visual representation of her argument. Her advisor is uncertain as to whether he should allow this project, since the traditional format for the thesis is a paper. In this situation, Lily and her advisor are considering issues related to information creation as a process. Lily's advisor recognizes that the format of an information source can have a significant impact on the perceived value of that information, and worries that allowing Lily to present her work in a non-traditional format may mean that her work is not taken seriously. He decides to leave the choice up to Lily. In making her decision, she must recognize that, even though her research may be strong, the format in which she chooses to present her work will impact the way the message is received, and that in the academic context, there's often uncertainty about the usefulness of research that is presented in a non-traditional format. Understanding this concept will help Lily make informed choices about the directions for her own research.
Sorry about that. All right. So information creation as a process. What this concept looks like, as you saw from the video, it really focuses on how information products are created and the formats that information products come in, and how that impacts how those products are understood, how they are received, how they are valued. When I think of this process, the framework itself went through several iterations, and an original version of this concept was basically called information formats. And so that kind of helps as I think about what this process means. Formats is really important, thinking about all of the different information formats there are, what it means to have information created in a particular format, how format is tied to the creation process, or how format implies a specific types of creation processes. We know when we see an article that is in a peer-reviewed journal article, as scholars and academics, we have an understanding of what that creation process for that format was, right? And we also recognize that some information formats may be better suited for conveying certain types of information or for meeting certain types of information needs. So as expert researchers, we understand that different types of information products are valued differently depending on the context, right? Certain types of products are going to be more highly valued in the academic world. Certain types of information products may be more valued in the professional world, in industry. And so learning to recognize the different formats of information or the different types of information products that are most valued in your particular field or discipline is an important part of becoming part of that discipline. Recognizing how information is presented has implications for how that information is valued or the perceived value of that information. And part of that is because certain information formats, there are certain things we know about the pre-publication process of that or the review process for those types of formats. And those we take as indicators of quality, right? We know that when we see a scholarly journal article that it has been through a pre-publication process that has included a peer review process. And that to us is an indicator of quality. We also recognize that that's not always the case and that there are plenty of, peer review articles that are not in the end very great. But it is one thing that we can look for as we think about different information formats that we encounter and which ones may be more appropriate to use. So we as experts are able to match information products with information needs, right? And this also involves knowing, where to go to search. We know I need this type of information, so I'm going to go this place because that's where I can find these kinds of information formats. And this is something that students may struggle with. They may not know where to go to find the types of information products that they need to meet their particular information needs. As experts, we also understand that these processes of how information is created and disseminated are always changing, rapidly changing, and that there are sort of the traditional processes, but there are also emerging processes, and we have to recognize and think about what non-traditional information formats look like, how those creation processes work, and be aware of those different processes. And so we also understand that when we make a decision, when we as our information creators, how we share our information is going to impact how that information is viewed, right? If we decide to publish a journal article versus doing a poster presentation versus doing some non-traditional format, such as Lily, if she decided to do her thesis as a comic book, that would impact the way that her research, or that could impact the way that her research would be viewed. And so recognizing that and making deliberate choices about the formats that we use to share information and how that will be received, the message that will be conveyed. So there's my quick overview of information creation as a process. I would like to take a break really quickly there and allow you a chance to think about how you would describe that in your own words. So if you did download the action plan, you can write your response on your action plan, or if you would prefer, you can share in the chat box just a quick, 1 or 2 sentence description of how you would describe this concept in your own words. We'll give everyone a minute to think about this. So Nick shared, creating information involves multiple steps from background reading and brainstorming a topic, search and evaluating resources, researching and summarizing relevant data, synthesizing data into novel interpretations and arguments, outlining the document, picking a format, drafting, editing, revising, reviewing, and then finally publishing. Absolutely. Great description, Nick. Vicki shared, information is created by different processes for different audiences. Megan shared, the process of processing and preparing information for dissemination to others in a format that will catch their attention and be seen as valid. And some of you that were here last week, you might be noticing a lot of overlap with this concept and the concept that we discussed last week, authority is constructed and contextual. There's definitely a lot of connections there in terms of the idea that certain formats are considered more authoritative than others. Certain creation processes are considered that lend themselves to making sources considered to be more authoritative. So you'll definitely see a lot of overlap there. So let's see, we have shared, readers will construct new meaning as they read, select, and integrate the information they think is valid and reliable to their topics. We also have choosing the format that elicits the desired reaction from your audience is part of the research process. Yep. Those are all great descriptions. Thank you all for sharing those. I think we'll go ahead and move on, and please continue to share in the chat if you would like. Okay. So this was my quick summary, the variety of different information creation processes and information formats. Depending on the context, certain creation processes and formats may be valued more than others. So it is necessary to consider the creation process and format when determining whether or not particular information product will meet an information need. So how does this impact students? I wanted to take another quick break there and give you a chance to think about any challenges or frustrations that you have seen in your students that you think might be related to this concept. You know, is there something that they're not grasping related to this concept that is contributing to student learning bottlenecks that you may be seeing? And on the other hand, when students get this concept, what really makes sense to them? What do they understand that they maybe didn't understand before? What are they able to do that they may not have really been able to do before? So I'll take another minute here, and again, we'll let you, if you wanted to share your responses to the chat or add yours to your action plan document, either way. Want to think about this, and then I'll, in the next part, we're going to go through and look more specifically at some potential bottlenecks and that students might have. So a couple comments that we have, let's see. The struggle to see the importance of following a template for structure and format, absolutely. They struggle with understanding why academic journals are typically more valuable for their scholarship than other information containers, definitely. I think that part of that is because they may not be have a really good understanding of the process that goes into creating articles in academic journals, and so they don't understand why scholars see those as being more valuable. I think they have a pretty good understanding of traditional formats, argumentative papers, traditional essays, other formats throw them a curveball. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's true for a lot of experts as well. Oftentimes when we encounter information in a format maybe that we're not familiar with, we don't know quite what to make of it or how to trust it because we've become so accustomed to relying on the peer review process in scholarly journals. So they may be taking a class that is not in their major and will have a more difficult time fitting their strengths into that discipline. Right. Students may not be aware of the format that best supports their research, either a systematic review or a narrative review. Yes. I think that's a great point, Tracy, that even within these broad formats, there are so many sub-formats within, when you think about scholarly journal articles, think about how many types of scholarly journal articles there are and how challenging it can be to determine the best format for you. Having difficulties in understanding their sources is such as journal articles and integrating the information they selected into their own writing to enhance their arguments. Yeah, integrating information from different source types is definitely a challenge for students, absolutely. One struggle is not being able to distinguish between the content of a source and its format. That is a great point, absolutely. Sometimes they just want to get the assignment over without even attempting to add sources. Maybe that's because they're not understanding the format and the importance of always included sources. Yep, Jennifer, that's true. I'm sure that I'm not the only librarian who's had a student say to me, I've written my paper, now I need to find my sources. So there's definitely a real misunderstanding at times for students with how the role that sources play in academic research, absolutely. Right, so we'll go ahead and I'm just going to highlight really quickly some of the bottlenecks that I see. So some of the things that the challenges or frustrations that students might be experiencing related to this concept. So student learning bottlenecks, if you're not familiar with that term, that basically just refers to those places where a lot of students tend to get stuck. So those things that you see over and over again, semester after semester, those parts of the research process where students might be struggling. And these are things that many of you have already mentioned. So information creation and dissemination. Understanding the process by which different information products are created and disseminated. Students may not understand how the peer review process works, but they may not understand how news articles are published, you know, how other types of information formats are created and shared. And this is even more challenging because there are so many different ways to share information now, and the whole information landscape is so rapid. There's so many options. The traditional, what we would call gatekeepers, for example, for publishing, don't really exist. Anyone can basically publish anything and make it available to anyone online. And so it can be a real challenge to understand, you know, how rapidly this system is progressing, all of the different ways that information can be created and shared. Identifying information formats. Again, this is something that we've already talked about, but it's definitely something that I've seen, and I know that most of you have seen as well. It's just identifying the format of an information source. You know, give students a link and have them go out and look at this. Is this a website? Is this a blog post? Is this a news article? Is this a scholarly journal article? Because most of the information is now accessed online directly through links, you know, it ends up all looking the same. And I know I've mentioned in previous workshops this idea of container collapse. The markers, the boundaries between different types of containers no longer exist, or they're blurred. You know, I often have trouble distinguishing between, you know, news articles, magazine articles, blog posts. You know, the lines are just so blurry in a lot of ways between information formats. And it's also important to remember that many of our students have had very limited exposure to the more traditional types of information formats. Many of them may have never held a print scholarly journal in their hand, you know, have very limited exposure to print newspapers or you know, I was walking by my neighbor's house the other day and saw that they got a print newspaper, and I actually paused and looked at it because it had been so long since I'd seen a print newspaper on someone's step. And a lot of our students don't really have that experience. And so all of those traditional markers of information formats, you know, they don't really exist in a lot of ways for students anymore. One of the things that I've seen with students a lot is the idea that journal articles are in journals is something that students really struggle to get, the difference between the article and the journal, because they've never seen an actual journal together with all of the articles in one place. They just see individual discrete articles and don't see them as being part of something larger. So matching format to context, again, we've mentioned this, but determining what types of formats are considered more appropriate or more relevant or more authoritative in this particular context or with my particular information need. If I need this type of information, it's best if I look for a government report. If I need this type of information, I should look at encyclopedia, right? So recognizing what types of formats are best suited to their particular information needs, and determining the value of those formats that are in non-traditional formats. So I'll take another pause there really quickly to see if there are any questions or comments before we move on. So I'll just give it 30 seconds or so. Okay. So just going back really quickly. So with this slide, we asked two questions. The first was challenges or frustrations that students experience related to this concept. So that was the student learning bottlenecks. And in this next section, I want to look at the second question, you know, when students get this concept, what really makes sense to them? What are they able to do or able to understand that maybe they didn't get before? And that's where we can talk about knowledge, practices, and dispositions. So the framework for information literacy outlines what they call knowledge practices, which are basically like actions, as well as dispositions, which are more like ways of thinking or habits that students demonstrate once they start to develop a grasp of this concept. So these are the things that students, once they are really starting to understand this, what they should be able to do or what they should be able to understand or how they should approach research. So as they're developing their understanding of information creation as process, Students should be able to articulate the capabilities and constraints of information developed through different processes. All right, so understanding how the information, the creation process impacts how information can or should be used. Recognizing that information may be perceived differently based on format, and being able to assess the fit between a creation process and a particular information need. So those are the knowledge practices. Those are examples of things that students should be able to do once they are developing their understanding of this concept. Dispositions, so these are things, ways that students should approach research, or things that should, habits that they should have. So they should develop the habit of seeking out the characteristics that indicate the creation process and learning to recognize what those are there. They should be able to accept the ambiguity of information that's created in emerging formats or new, non-traditional formats. And for themselves as information creators, understanding that there are a variety of different methods that they can disseminate their own information with different purposes, depending on what their purpose is, the audience that they're trying to reach. And so thinking of themselves as information creators and making deliberate and wise choices about how they share information that they create. Okay. So those are just a few examples of the knowledge practices and dispositions related to this concept. If you would like to see the full list of those, the link is available, and Stephanie will also add that link into the chat box. And then we wanted to give everyone another minute to take a look at those knowledge practices and dispositions, and think about any that you think are particularly relevant to any challenges that you're seeing in your students, or things that you really want your students to develop or be able to do. So we'll give you a minute. Again, you can write your answers on your action plan document if you would like to do that, or you can share those into the chat box. Thanks, Kathy. It was great to have you here. Yeah, definitely look forward to talking to you soon. So we'll give it just another 30 seconds if anyone has anything to share about the knowledge practices or dispositions they find most relevant, and then we'll go ahead and look at some potential activities or assignments that might be helpful in helping students to develop an understanding of this concept. Okay, so how can we teach this concept? I'm going to go through briefly several different potential assignments or activities. We don't have time to really go in depth into any of those, but if you are interested in seeing more complete versions of the assignment, they will be available in the workshop materials that we'll make available to everyone afterwards. So not every single one that I'm going to talk about will have a full version available, but there are about 10 different assignments in the workshop materials that are more fully developed that everyone will have access to. So if you've been one of these workshops before, I always recommend starting really small and just getting a discussion going with students about this concept. So you could show students the video that we watched earlier, and then have them write just a quick 1-minute response, have a discussion based on, having them start to think about information creation as a process, information formats, and what that might mean to them. There's another video, information creation process, that I'm sharing as well. This is also a good one that you could share. It's from McMaster University. TrueFalse Activities, this is my favorite kind of activity. Everyone knows that I've mentioned TrueFalse Activity in every one of these workshops, but I do think this is like a really quick 10, 15-minute activity that you can do with students, having them work in groups or, for an online class on a discussion board, considering which statements are true and which statements are false, and explaining why. I think this can be really helpful for identifying some of the misconceptions that that students might have about different information formats, about different information creation processes, and just highlighting especially those things that you really want students to know about how information is created or shared, or different information formats that are most relevant or most appropriate for your particular field. Another activity, this is a version of an activity that I also mentioned in previous workshops, but with a slightly different focus. And so basically providing students with note cards with the names of different types of information sources, ranging from academic journal articles to blog posts, even tweets, industry reports. You can think about the types of information sources that are generally most used in your field. And then providing students with different questions or scenarios that make them think about the information creation process for that source. So asking them to rank the sources by which of these takes the most time, to create from the beginning of the process to publication. Which of these types of sources takes more time to create? Which of these types of sources generally requires the most expertise? Which of these types of sources are most heavily reviewed before publication? So having them, giving them several different questions related to information creation process, information dissemination process, and having them rank and reorder the cards based on the responses to that question. Again, I think it can be helpful just as a way to having them start thinking and understanding that all of these different information creation processes impact how these different sources, may be appropriate to use. A really good resource is an infographic that was created by the Portland Community College Library called Know Your Sources. And I'm gonna try to go out to see that one. It's always kind of weird to share when everyone is sharing. So hopefully you guys are actually seeing this source now that's called Know Your Sources. If you're not, go ahead and just note it in the checkbox so I make sure that I'm on the right page. But this is a really great resource that outlines several different types of sources. So we do not see it, still see your slide, so great. Thank you, Stephanie. 1 second, I'm gonna stop sharing. It's always so odd about sharing. And share again. Okay, hopefully now you all should be seeing this. Okay, so I actually can't see the chat now. But I'll just very briefly outline. You can see that it brings up different types of sources and then looks at publication records, the degree of scrutiny before it is published, the degree of author education, number of outside sources that are used, even average word per sources, the background knowledge that is required to really understand that source. So you can see that this is really a helpful way of getting students to start distinguishing between the creation process for different types of sources. So I'm gonna stop sharing again for a second, try to go back to my PowerPoint. Try to get back to assignments. Okay, so hopefully everyone is now seeing the PowerPoint again. So Stephanie, are you seeing the PowerPoint?
Yes, Jane, I'm seeing it.
Okay, apologies. Okay, so we'll go ahead then and move forward. A few other examples. This is a similar example to what we were just talking about when we're having students think about different types of sources, but in this case, you would give them the actual information sources. So identifying a topic or research question, an issue that is relevant in your field, giving them actual examples of different types of sources that are focused on that topic, and having them compare those sources in terms of thinking about the creation process for those sources, the value of those sources for conveying different types of information. So which formats allow for information to be shared most rapidly, which formats are most easily accessible for large amounts of people, which formats allow you to provide the most detail or context. So having students look at a variety of different types of sources on a particular topic and then think about those in relation to that creation process and the format of those sources. This is a similar example, but it's something where you could identify a particular question or topic or give students a group of questions on that topic. Each group, dividing students into groups, each group only gets one source that they could use. So one group might get a scholarly journal article on the topic, one group might get a news article, one group might get a tweet, and they can only answer the questions that you give them based on the information that is provided in their particular source. And then you could have a discussion on which types of sources allowed you to answer the most questions. You know, you might be that, question, 1 and 2 can be answered by a tweet, but the rest of the questions can't. Question, 5, 6, and 7, they can only be answered by a scholarly journal article or a news article. So allowing them to see that each of those different types of sources has value and can give you important information, but they have different purposes. Right? And so certain types of sources are going to be better for answering certain types of questions than others. The information cycle. This is a great way of thinking about information formats and information creation processes. The information cycle is a model that describes how information is created after a particular event. And the types of information formats that are created and who's creating that type of information in the time period after an event. So what's being created as an event is taking place, who's creating that information, who's sharing that information, what formats does that information come in, after days or after weeks or after months, how does that change? What new types of formats become available? How does who's creating that information? How does that compare to that information that was created immediately or during an event? And so providing students with different sources covering an event or development and having them organize those sources based on where they fall in the information cycle can be a really great way of getting them to see, I think, that, again, each of these different types of sources can have value, but certain types of sources are going to be available right after the event, and they're going to have different weaknesses and different benefits, but other types of sources might not be created until later. Another version of this assignment, this is one that we do in our Arts and Sciences 2120 course that we teach. We provide students with a scenario and have them describe what the information cycle looks like and depict what the information cycle looks like following that particular event. And we actually use a fictitious event where we say, there's a statue of William Thompson that stands outside of Thompson Library. And we say, okay, imagine that statue is struck by lightning and comes to life and starts walking around the library. You're a student studying in the library when this happens. Describe what the information cycle would look like from the moment that you see him to a year after the event takes place. And we really encourage students to be very creative, and we get some really great and fun responses. Your students, some will make drawings or make PowerPoint presentations, but even written responses, students will often write a narrative, and they'll, a first-person narrative of themselves as they're viewing this, what's going on. One of our students last semester ended up with the statue was living in the 11th floor of the library, and that was like his permanent home from then on. So very fun, always interesting assignments to grade, and really helpful for getting students to see what types of formats are created and available after after specific events or developments. Let me just check my time real quick here. So earlier I showed you the Know Your Sources infographic. That is a great source, but it is getting a little bit old, and it is also not really discipline specific. So I think a great assignment would be to having your students use that as a guide, create their own version, focusing specifically on the types of sources that are most relevant to the course or the discipline, and giving students some questions to guide them or some categories that they need to include. They need to, for each type of source they list, they need to talk about the creation time, the author expertise, the review process. I think having students create that or recreate that infographic for a particular course would be a really interesting and fun assignment. We've already mentioned peer review, and that students may struggle with really understanding the peer review process and how that works. There's a great video from North Carolina State University called Peer Review in 3 Minutes that has a really quick overview of peer review. But related to that, there also is sometimes the challenge that once they learn about peer-reviewed sources, students, they automatically trust them without being aware of what, you know, some of the challenges that might come with those sources. So having them explore the Retraction Watch website in conjunction with watching that video, and then thinking about both the benefits and the limitations of the peer review process and the value of peer-reviewed sources. Creating a bibliography of non-traditional sources. So we often have students create their bibliography on a topic, and we required them to use academic peer-reviewed sources, and obviously there's nothing wrong with that. But it also might be interesting to have students create non-traditional bibliography and compare what information they get from those non-traditional sources versus the information that they get from their traditional sources. So I think you could have students create 2 bibliographies. One group creates the traditional one group creates the non-traditional one, and then comparing what information that they can get depending on the format of the sources that they are using. This is not really an activity, but more just a strategy that we use. In our courses, we do tend to allow students a lot of leeway in the format that they produce for their final information products. So a lot online videos, podcasts, PowerPoints. We allow a lot of different types of formats. And I think that that's always interesting, and you can always ask students to include a reflection thinking about why they selected that particular information format and how they may think it might impact the way that their work is understood. This is an assignment that I actually haven't done before, but I think it would be really interesting, is students picking a research topic or a question. They produce a traditional written response, a short paper, with 5 or 10 sources, depending on how many would work for your course. And then having them share their same findings in a non-traditional format, a video, comic, drawing, and again, having them reflect on how their own understanding of that topic might have changed based on the format that they were using, how it changed the information that they were able to convey, how much information, how they had to present that information, how well they think that format conveys their findings or their thoughts on a topic. I think that would also be really interesting. So we're gonna take another pause here really quickly and just give you time to think about any of those assignments that you thought that were really relevant. If you did like any, you can go ahead and add those into your action plan document or think about how you might adapt one for your own course. And we also want you to think a little bit about the information creation processes in your field and the information formats in your field. Are there certain types or formats of information that are most valued? Are there any information formats that are not valued? These are the kinds of things that, that you understand about your field that students may struggle with. And so I think it's always important and helpful to kind of try to raise some of that to the surface a little bit. So we'll take one more quick pause here. just to give you time to think about that, share any thoughts that you might have in the chat. And then we will move to wrapping things up. And I can't, for some reason at the moment, actually access the chat. So if Stephanie, if we are getting anything in the chat, please let me know.
We have a comment. The comment is from Nick. And Nick says they like the format timeline. And maybe make a question relevant to drug use in American culture. Drug X is superpowers or something.
Yeah. So unfortunately, yeah, the sound is really breaking up for me. I have no idea why. I hope people have been able to hear me without too much difficulty. So one of the challenges of doing virtual workshops. This is the first one where we've had any tech issues, really. So.
Lita also has a comment. Using video gaming formats for teaching hip-hop research.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's interesting, Lita, thinking about the formats that we use to teach and what messages we convey by the specific format that we've selected to teach and how we can reach students. That's a really great idea, really great thought.
Yeah, Jane, I think I'm echoing through your audio.
So apologies everyone for the technical difficulties. I'm going to go ahead and just really quickly go through. I think I've got just a couple more slides and then we'll open it up for more questions. And hopefully we can try to figure out what might be going on with the chat and the sound. So we'll just go ahead really quickly. I had you all take a minute to think about what you know about the information formats that are most commonly used or most commonly valued in your field. And I think an interesting assignment that could allow students to get a handle on that would be to provide students with, a source, a journal article, a book, a government report, some type of source that's fairly, well-known and valued in your field. And having students look at the citations in that source and select a certain number of those citations. You could perhaps divide the citation list among students if you have, 50 citations or more, and have them locate each of those sources and determine what type of source it is. And then create some sort of group document where you list all of the types of sources that were cited in that particular article or that particular book. And that can be a really interesting way to get them to see that, in this field, the most commonly things that are cited are going to be journal articles, conference proceedings, books, and maybe in this field, you might have more news articles that are cited. So having them look and see what other scholars in the field tend to cite and the information formats that they tend to use, I think might be an interesting activity as well. So the final reflection is just thinking about how you plan to teach or incorporate information creation as process into a class or an assignment. I will give everyone time to share any thoughts that they have on their action plan document. And then we'll just very briefly wrap up, share some final information with everyone. So if you do have questions, again, I am always happy to talk about this, so please go ahead and send me an email. It's hammonds.73@osu.edu. If you would like to access the workshop materials, it's go.osu.edu/infocreation. And I'll send everyone an email afterwards that has this link as well as the PowerPoint from today. If you're interested in attending our next workshop in the series, or actually our last workshop in the series, which will be focused on searching as strategic exploration, that will be next Thursday at noon. And again, if you would like a deeper dive into information literacy, you're always welcome to enroll in our Teaching Information Literacy endorsement that's available through the Drake Institute. That is a fully online course, self-paced, that takes about 10 to 12 hours to complete, and eligible faculty or eligible instructors who complete that can earn the Teaching Information Literacy endorsement. Previous workshop materials are available, and again, I'll include these in the links to the email that I share with everyone. And last, just some references there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop sharing my screen in the hopes that perhaps I will be able to see the chat when I do that. Okay, so great. If you do have questions, thankfully now I can see the chat. I have no idea why I could not see it while I was screen sharing. But yeah, any questions, any comments, anything that you would like to share about any of the activities or assignments that you thought were interesting, or your own plans for how you might teach this concept, I would love to hear those in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I will be sticking around for a few more minutes, so again, you can all please share. And if not, I think, yeah, we have covered everything that we had planned to cover today. So I want to thank you all again for coming. I want to thank Stephanie for her assistance today. It's really great. It's so wonderful to have someone available when we do have kinds of issues like that. So I really appreciate you taking the time, Stephanie, to help out today. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Brian. Thanks, everyone. It's great to hear from everyone today. Apologies again for the weird technical issues. I'm going to go ahead, I think, and stop recording now.